Some geniuses never walk into classrooms under bright lights, never wear the polished robe of graduation. They come from broken homes, from the dust of forgotten towns, from hands roughened by labor. Yet sometimes it is a janitor's hands, the same hands that hold a mop, that quietly hold the key to problems the scientific world has wrestled with for decades. This is the story of Ethan Miller, a quiet janitor at Harvard, carrying a family tragedy carved deep in his heart, yet bearing a mind bright as a torch in the winter night. The sound of rubber soles echoed faintly on the marble floors of Widener Library. Late at night, Harvard stood in solemn silence, its tall windows shivering with the Boston wind. Ethan Miller bent his narrow shoulders, hands calloused and worn, gripping a mop and sweeping long strokes across the floor. They say Harvard is the beating heart of American knowledge, where Nobel laureates pass by as if it were ordinary. But for Ethan, Harvard was not a lecture hall. It was shelter. It was a temporary roof over days adrift. He was 24, tall but gaunt, shoulders hunched from years of labor, brown hair unkempt, gray eyes downcast. Students in pressed jackets passed him daily, never guessing that this janitor once dreamed of standing at a lectern himself. Back in Appalachia, a small-town teacher had once whispered, "Ethan's head belongs in a university." But that dream died with his grandmother, the frail woman who had raised him, on a bitter winter night. His father, a coal miner and a drunk, had perished in an underground blast. His mother had died too early for Ethan to remember her face. The only trace was a faded handkerchief folded in a drawer. He carried his grief in silence, as if stitched into the lining of his coat. Tonight, like every other night, he moved quietly down the hall. But as he passed one classroom, he stopped. The door was ajar. A golden lamp cast its glow onto a blackboard covered in chalk. Lines of geometry, curves, and symbols tangled like a labyrinth. Ethan stepped inside. He set the mop against the wall and gazed at the board. It wasn't an ordinary assignment. It was a problem in combinatorial geometry, one the graduate students had been circling all semester, proving the existence of a symmetrical structure in four-dimensional space. To most, the markings were chaos. To Ethan, they were a half-finished poem. He smiled, rarely, faintly. His finger traced the chalk lines, following the gaps where thought had faltered. In his mind, shapes unfolded. A cube twisting, opening like a flower, then spinning into a fourth dimension. Group theory, Cayley's theorem, fragments from books he had read in secret. Their echoes returned like a river breaking its dam. But Ethan didn't write on the board. He only memorized the symbols, storing them carefully in the quiet vault of his mind. That night, back in his shabby rented room outside Cambridge, he pulled a small mirror from the bathroom wall. For Ethan, the mirror was a blackboard. He wrote with a marker, wiped it clean, wrote again. Steam clouded the glass, his breath heavy with concentration. Outside, ambulance sirens wailed through Boston. Inside, Ethan murmured formulas to himself, each symbol a lifeline between his orphaned past and the hunger that still burned in him. He remembered being 12. His grandmother had brought home a battered math book from a flea market, the spine torn, pages yellowed. Inside was the proof of the Pythagorean theorem. Ethan read it until he could recite it by heart. That night he drew triangles on the dirt floor, and his grandmother, watching, whispered, "Son, you were born to go farther than this place." She died a few years later, leaving him to the silence of the hills. Now, as he scribbled on the mirror of a Harvard bathroom, her voice returned like a ghost. His hand raced, symbols spiraling, chasing the missing piece of the puzzle. Hours passed. At 3 a.m, he stopped. His eyes lit with the clarity of someone who had glimpsed a secret door. Not the full proof, not yet, but a step forward, a step no graduate student had seen. The next day, Ethan returned to his shift. Widener's halls echoed once more with the soft tap of his shoes. He waited until the lecture room emptied. His chest thudded. He dropped the mop, picked up a stick of chalk, and for a moment, the janitor of Harvard vanished. A mathematician stood in his place. He wrote swiftly, quietly, just enough to close the gap he had found. Then he set the chalk down. No name, no trace. Only a few lines of truth, left on the board like a whisper in the dark. That afternoon, the students walked in. Their chatter turned to gasps. "Oh my God, who wrote this?" "This is the missing step. Professor Whitman will lose his mind." Ethan, mopping the corridor just beyond the door, heard their voices echo. He bowed his head and smiled, his hands tightening around the mop handle. No one knew that the same hands had just penned the line that untied their knot. And in Ethan's chest, a small fire began to glow. The morning sun reached Harvard's red brick walls with a stern kind of beauty. It was not a gentle warmth, but a crisp New England light, the kind that sharpens the edges of windows and makes even the smallest shadow seem deliberate. Students hurried across the yard with steaming coffee in hand, their voices young, quick, and ambitious. But Ethan Miller walked alone, mop handle balanced across his shoulders like a weary yoke. To others he was invisible, a shadow moving through the grandeur of Harvard, unseen by those who believed they were the center of its life. Yet behind Ethan's silence lay a weight far heavier than the mop he carried. Memories have a way of clawing back when one is most unguarded. For Ethan, the sight of boys his age in clean jackets sometimes tore open an old wound that never truly closed. He had not always been alone. There was once a little house in the hills of Appalachia where laughter, though rare, sometimes lived. His grandmother kept it alive. A thin woman with hands cracked from years of washing and mending, she became his shelter after the world stripped him bare. His mother had passed before he could form lasting memories of her face. All Ethan carried was a faded handkerchief she once embroidered with the letter M. He would fold it carefully, as if it were a relic of a saint. His father, though alive in those early years, was like a storm cloud, dark, unpredictable, and always ready to break. A coal miner hardened by dust and drink, he staggered home with liquor on his breath and rage in his voice. Ethan learned early how to make himself small, how to disappear into corners of the house until the storm passed. But some nights, storms find you even in corners. One evening when Ethan was 10, his father came home to find the boy bent over a notebook, sketching diagrams from a borrowed geometry text. The man's hands, scarred and heavy, tore the notebook in half. "Books won't feed you," he had spat. "The mine will." Ethan said nothing. He never did. But that night he buried the torn pages under a loose floorboard, as though one day he might piece them back together. 2 years later, the mines claimed his father completely. A blast in the dark tunnels shook the earth like judgment. 30 men went in. Not all came out. His father's body was carried up in silence, the same silence Ethan had learned to wear. It was then his grandmother, already frail, became the only thread holding him to life. She believed in the boy's gift. She could not name theorems or proofs, but she saw the light in his eyes when he drew triangles in the dirt. She saved pennies to buy him a used algebra book at a flea market, pressing it into his hands like a holy scripture. "You have a head the world should see," she told him. "Don't let this place swallow you." Ethan read until candle stubs burned down to nothing. Numbers were his refuge. Where his house creaked with emptiness, equations filled the silence with structure. Proofs were promises that the world, though broken, could still be held together by logic. But the body fails, even when hope is strong. His grandmother's heart gave out one January night when the hills were buried in snow. Ethan found her slumped in the rocker, her knitting needles fallen still. He was 16. The sound of the clock ticking in that cabin was the loudest noise he had ever heard. From that night forward, the boy became a drifter. He left school, took odd jobs in town, slept on couches or in the back rooms of kind neighbors. Teachers tried to reach him, but grief is a wall few words can cross. Eventually, he boarded a bus north, carrying a single bag, the algebra book, and the faded handkerchief. Boston was colder, but at least it was not home. Here, Ethan worked kitchens, washed windows, and finally found steady work at Harvard as a janitor. It paid little, but it gave him keys to the halls where the air itself seemed to hum with knowledge. He could not sit in lectures, but he could polish their floors. He could not sign his name in journals, but he could breathe the same dust that rose from chalkboards where theorems bloomed. And so the wounds followed him into the ivy-covered walls. He carried them like invisible scars, each one shaping the silence that wrapped around him. That afternoon, as Ethan scrubbed a stairwell, he heard two students debating in rapid tones. Their words spilled out: manifold, tensor, isomorphism. To anyone else, the vocabulary was foreign. To Ethan, it was music half-remembered. He whispered the terms under his breath, tasting them as if they were fragments of a language he had once spoken in another life. But just as the music swelled, another sound cut through, the harsh laugh of one student mocking the other's mistake. Ethan's grip tightened on the mop handle. He remembered the coal dust on his father's jacket, the anger that silenced every mistake with violence. His chest clenched. He turned away before they noticed him. That night, Ethan returned to his tiny room. He pulled the mirror from the wall again and began writing. But this time, the symbols blurred. His hand trembled not from fatigue, but from the weight of memory. He dropped the marker, covered his face, and for the first time in years, let tears fall onto the cracked linoleum floor. Family wounds do not heal with time alone. They echo in every silence, in every corner of the life one tries to build. And yet, as Ethan wiped his face, he felt something stir. Beneath the grief, beneath the anger, there was still the ember his grandmother had lit. The algebra book, frayed and yellowed, still sat on his desk. He opened it, traced the numbers with his finger, and whispered, "I'm still here." Outside, the city's lamps flickered against the snow. Inside, a young man scarred by family loss bent once more to the language that had never abandoned him. Numbers, pure and incorruptible. And though he did not know it yet, the wounds he carried would one day collide with Harvard's own ambitions, and the quiet janitor would become a figure impossible to ignore. Harvard at night was a cathedral of silence. The wide corridors, lined with portraits of long-dead scholars, seemed to breathe in the dim light. Their painted eyes watched over the living as if demanding proof that the legacy of knowledge would be carried forward. Ethan Miller moved through this silence as he always did, mop in hand, steps soft, a shadow among shadows. The world never expected footprints from a janitor. He was meant to erase traces, not leave them. But on this night, the balance shifted. Inside one of the math lecture rooms, chalk dust still floated in the air. The blackboard stretched across the wall like a battlefield scarred with equations. Some lines were confident, others scratched out in defeat. The evening seminar had ended hours ago, but its struggle lingered in white fragments. Ethan entered slowly, heart thudding. He knew what stood on the board. For weeks he had traced the problem in his mind, carrying it like a secret flame, a question in combinatorial geometry, a proof that certain symmetrical structures must exist in higher dimensions. To most, it was abstract torment. To Ethan, it was as tangible as the beams of the ceiling overhead. He set the mop down. His rough hands reached for a piece of chalk. The weight of it startled him. Fragile, Brittle, it could break at the slightest pressure. Yet it was also the same instrument that carved ideas into permanence. He hesitated. In his chest, the voice of caution stirred. What if they find out? What if they laugh? You are only a janitor. But another voice rose, quieter yet steadier, the voice that belonged to his grandmother. Do not let this place swallow you. The chalk touched the board. The sound was faint, like the scratch of a match in darkness. Ethan's hand moved quickly, not daring to pause. He filled the gap the students had missed, an intermediate lemma that unlocked the next step. The proof was not complete, but the door was open. He stepped back, breathing hard. The lines glowed under the lamp, neat and certain. For the first time in years, Ethan had placed himself in the world not as a cleaner of dust, but as a maker of thought. Yet the victory was not for applause. He dropped the chalk, picked up his mop, and walked away without a glance. By morning, no one would know his name. Only the lines on the board would remain. When dawn broke, the students returned. Coffee cups in hand, they shuffled into the lecture room, their conversations half distracted. One of them stopped mid-sentence. Wait, look at this. They gathered. Silence fell. The messy battlefield from last night now bore a path, a clean sequence of steps leading through the confusion. Who did this? One whispered. Whitman's gonna lose his mind. This is the missing piece. Their astonishment spread like fire. In minutes, whispers carried across the yard. Someone had cracked the problem. Professor Charles Whitman heard the commotion before he saw the board. A man of 60 with sharp features and a reputation for rigor, he entered the room, expecting exaggeration. But when his eyes fell upon the chalk lines, his lips parted. It was precise, elegant, the work of a mind that saw not only the numbers, but the symmetry behind them. Whitman's chest tightened. One of my graduate students, he thought. But he had watched them struggle for months. None had written like this. Who solved it? He demanded. Silence. No student stepped forward. The professor's gaze swept the room, searching, doubting. His pride resisted the idea that such insight had slipped past him. He left without a word, but the seed of suspicion had been planted. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his shift as though nothing had happened. He emptied trash bins, scrubbed stairwells, carried buckets down echoing halls. Yet inside, something shifted. For the first time, his silence had a witness. That night, he returned to his small room. He placed the algebra book and the handkerchief on the desk, as he always did. But now he also placed a piece of chalk he had pocketed, a trophy, fragile and dusty. He turned it in his fingers, smiling faintly. Ethan was not seeking glory. He did not even dream of it. What he longed for was simpler. To know that his mind still had a place in the world, that the fire his grandmother had seen was not extinguished. But the academic world has sharp eyes. A trace left behind is never ignored for long. Days later, Professor Whitman convened another seminar. He posed a new problem, more difficult, one that had haunted his colleagues for years. With a half smile, he announced to the class, "On the board, you see a statement that took us 2 years to prove. Perhaps our mystery solver will favor us again." Students laughed nervously. The challenge hung in the air. That evening, as the classroom emptied, Ethan stood once more before the blackboard. His heart raced. This was not child's play. The professor had placed a trap, baited with unsolved brilliance, but Ethan's mind leapt toward it. He could not resist. Symbols tumbled in his imagination like stars forming constellations. He did not finish the proof. That would take more than a night. Yet he sketched a crucial insight, a path where others had seen only wilderness. This time, however, he had lingered too long. The door creaked. Professor Whitman himself stepped out of his office. "What are you doing?" he barked. Ethan froze, chalk in hand. Sorry, just cleaning. He tried to leave, but Whitman blocked his way. That's not cleaning. That's mathematics. Ethan's face burned. He dropped the chalk and slipped past before Whitman could stop him. The professor turned back to the board and felt his breath catch. The lines were correct. Not vandalism, not graffiti. Truth. Whitman stood alone in the empty room, staring at the silent handwriting of a ghost. In the corridors outside, Ethan walked faster, clutching his mop. He had broken his vow of invisibility. He had left behind a second trace, and though he longed to vanish again, the tides of Harvard had already shifted. The silent janitor had stepped into the realm of the scholars, and the scholars would not rest until they knew his name. Morning light fell across Harvard Yard like a pale veil, softening the sharp brick outlines of its oldest halls. Students streamed into Sever Hall, clutching notebooks, their voices buzzing with rumor. The whispers had spread. A ghost in the mathematics department, a hidden hand solving problems meant to stump even the brightest doctoral candidates. At the front of the seminar room, Professor Charles Whitman adjusted his spectacles. His hair, once dark and strong, had turned silver, yet his presence carried the authority of a man who had spent a lifetime wrestling with numbers. He was not a man given to flights of fancy, and yet, deep in his chest, a nervous energy trembled. On the blackboard behind him glared a new problem, dense, forbidding, its symbols twisting like tangled vines. It was no ordinary exercise. This was a fragment of one of the clay millennium problems, the Navier-Stokes equations of fluid dynamics. The challenge was simple to state. In three-dimensional space, can smooth solutions always exist, or do they sometimes break into singularities, points where order collapses into chaos? Generations of mathematicians had tried, leaving behind pages of failed proofs. The Clay Institute had offered $1 million for a solution. Whitman turned to his class. Ladies and gentlemen, what you see before you is not a trick. This is one of the deepest mysteries of modern mathematics. 2 years of our own department's work has chipped only at its edges. And yet, someone among us, he paused, letting the words fall heavy. Someone has already written truths upon this board that startled me. A ripple passed through the students. Some leaned forward, eager. Others rolled their eyes, skeptical. Surely this was theater, another of Whitman's dramatic lectures. But Ethan Miller was not among them. He was outside, rolling a bucket down the corridor, the squeak of its wheels masking the beating of his heart. He knew what lay on the board. He had glimpsed it in passing the night before. Symbols like waves folding upon themselves, equations that spoke of turbulence and collapse. He had not meant to stare, yet he could not look away. Inside, the lecture began. Whitman launched into an exposition of fluid dynamics, his chalk tapping out the structure of incompressible flows. He sketched swirls and eddies, lines representing vorticity. He explained that while physicists modeled air over wings and currents through oceans, the fundamental existence of smooth solutions remained uncertain. Imagine, he said, a river flowing gently. Suddenly, it hits a rock. Does the water ripple smoothly, or does it explode into chaos? The Navier-Stokes equations should tell us, but we do not yet know if they always behave, or if, somewhere, they break apart. He turned, scanning the room. And so I offer this problem not merely as a challenge, but as a provocation. If our hidden solver walks among us, let him or her step forward. Silence. Dozens of eyes flickered, but no one moved. A cough broke the stillness, then faded. Whitman's lips pressed thin. Very well, he said curtly. We will continue as planned. Yet the moment did not end there. For in that silence, one janitor paused in the hallway, gripping his mop so tightly his knuckles whitened. Ethan felt the pull like a tide. His mind began to trace the currents, the eddies, the hidden structures of flow. He knew he should turn away. This was not his world, but numbers do not respect boundaries. That evening, after the room emptied, Ethan slipped inside. The board loomed above him, its unsolved heart daring him forward. He picked up the chalk, heart hammering. His strokes were quick, decisive. He did not attempt to solve the whole riddle. Such arrogance would be folly. Instead, he carved out a small path, a lemma about the boundedness of certain energy norms, a step that narrowed the wilderness. The chalk squeaked once, then fell silent. Ethan set it down and fled. The next morning, Professor Whitman returned to prepare his lecture. He stopped cold. The board bore fresh lines, tight and disciplined, linking yesterday's equations with an elegant estimate. His pulse quickened. He recognized the structure immediately, an idea he had wrestled with for months, now clarified in 3 neat lines. This cannot be," he whispered. His eyes darted to the door, half expecting the phantom mathematician to appear. By the time the students arrived, Whitman was pacing like a man possessed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice shaking with equal parts awe and fear, "we are in the presence of someone extraordinary. Last night this board was touched by a hand far beyond our own. The step written here is not trivial, it is profound." Gasps swept the room. Some leaned in, scribbling notes furiously. Others exchanged glances, incredulous. A doctoral candidate muttered, "It must be a trick. Some old proof recycled." Whitman slammed the chalk down. "No trick. This is new. And whoever wrote it understands these equations as if they were born inside them." Meanwhile, in the basement storage closet, Ethan sat on an overturned bucket, head bowed. He could already hear the storm gathering. Rumors were spreading faster than he could outrun. For the first time in years, he felt fear, not of fists or poverty, but of discovery. He remembered his father's words, "Books won't feed you. The mine will." He remembered the silence of his grandmother's funeral, the way the townsfolk had pitied him, whispering that smart boys from poor families never made it far. He had sworn not to draw attention, not to let the world mock him again. And yet, here he was, leaving traces in chalk. That evening, Whitman met privately with colleagues. Among them was Professor Adler, sharp-eyed, ambitious, and less charitable. He examined the board with a smirk. "Interesting," Adler said. "But how do you know this isn't the work of one of your own students, perhaps a prank?" Whitman shook his head. "I know my students. None of them think like this. This hand belongs to someone else." Adler leaned back, fingers steepled. "Then you have a problem, Charles. If a ghost walks among us, solving pieces of $1 million question, who gets the credit? You, the department, or some phantom?" The room fell quiet. Whitman felt the weight of his colleagues' stares. The thrill of discovery was already curdling into suspicion, ambition, and envy. Somewhere in the shadows, the first seeds of an academic conspiracy had been sown, and Ethan Miller, the janitor who wanted only silence, had just stepped into the storm. Boston nights carried a raw edge of salt and smoke, the kind that crept through alleyways and curled into a man's lungs. Ethan Miller walked those streets with his head lowered, shoulders hunched against the wind. He had finished his shift at Harvard, but the unease of discovery clung to him like damp clothes. Each step seemed to echo the same warning: they will find you. He wanted only to disappear into the crowd, to fade back into the quiet shadows of labor. But fate, like mathematics, has no patience for silence. On that Friday evening, in a bar on the edge of Cambridge, Ethan and a few fellow janitors nursed cheap beers. They were not close friends, men bound more by weariness than affection, but the laughter and jukebox noise gave Ethan a rare pocket of belonging. Then a voice cut through the bar. Rough, mocking, too familiar. Ethan turned and saw a man he recognized from childhood, a boy who had grown into cruelty, the kind who thrived on finding the weak spot in others. He was drunk now, sneering at a young woman passing by. The years collapsed in Ethan's chest. He was no longer in a Boston bar, but back in Appalachia, a skinny child cowering as taunts rained down. Rage swelled fast and uncontrollable. Before he could think, Ethan's fists were flying, chairs scraped, bottles shattered. The bar erupted into chaos. When the police siren screamed, it was too late. Hands wrenched his arms behind his back, steel cuffs bit into his wrists, and the night air closed around him like a cell. The courthouse smelled of paper and old wood. Ethan stood before the judge, clothes rumpled, eyes shadowed from a night in holding. His record lay open on the bench: petty fights, trespassing, the trail of a boy who had learned to survive with his fists when words were not enough. The prosecutor's voice was sharp. "Your Honor, this man has shown a pattern of violence. It is not his first offense. The people recommend jail time." Ethan lifted his chin. "Your Honor," he began, voice calm but firm, "I defended myself. That man has a history of harassment." The judge eyed him with weary skepticism. "You have a history too, Mr. Miller, and it is not one that inspires trust." The gavel struck. Bail set at $50,000. Motion to dismiss denied. Ethan's heart sank. $50,000 was more than he could imagine. The bars of a cell waited. But news travels swiftly in the halls of Harvard. By the time Ethan was led back to the holding room, Professor Charles Whitman was already on his way. Coat collar raised against the wind. He had read the police report with disbelief. The idea that the mysterious solver, the ghost of the blackboard, might vanish into prison unsettled him more than he cared to admit. That evening, Whitman appeared before the judge, his reputation opening doors Ethan could never touch. With measured words, he painted Ethan not as a criminal, but as a rare case. A mind of extraordinary promise trapped in unfortunate circumstance. "I am willing to take responsibility," Whitman declared. "Release him under my supervision. Let him study, let him work, and I will see that he also addresses his behavioral tendencies through therapy." The judge leaned back. "You vouch for him personally, Professor Whitman?" "I do." A pause, then the gavel struck again. "Very well. Release granted under 2 conditions. Weekly study with Professor Whitman. Weekly sessions with a licensed therapist. Reports will be filed. Any breach, and Mr. Miller returns to jail." Ethan, sitting stiffly, heard the verdict with a mixture of relief and dread. Freedom, yes, but freedom bound in chains of scrutiny. When he stepped out of the courthouse into the cold air, Whitman was waiting. "You're lucky," the professor said, adjusting his scarf. His eyes were stern, but there was something beneath them, curiosity, almost hunger. "Most men in your position would already be behind bars." Ethan shrugged. "I didn't ask for your help." "No," Whitman replied, "but you need it, and so does the world." He handed Ethan a slip of paper. "Your first session is Thursday, 4 o'clock. Do not be late." Ethan turned the paper in his hand, the letters swimming. A therapist, a stranger who would ask him to open doors he had nailed shut long ago. He felt his chest tighten. "I don't need therapy," he muttered. Whitman's gaze was steady. "If you want freedom, you do." That night, Ethan returned to his small rented room. He placed the chalk piece on the desk beside the worn algebra book, as he always did. But the objects seemed different now, as if marked by invisible chains. He was no longer free to disappear. His talent had been caught in the light, and the world would not let him retreat into shadows. He stared at the mirror where he had scrawled equations. The surface was smeared from endless erasures, like a battlefield of half-fought wars. He lifted the marker, then set it down. His hand shook. For the first time, solving a problem felt like a burden rather than a refuge. He whispered into the empty room, as if to his grandmother's memory, "They won't leave me alone now." Outside, the city carried on, horns blaring, footsteps hurrying, the endless noise of lives moving forward. Inside, Ethan sat in silence, caught between prison bars he could not see, and a future he could not yet imagine. But destiny had already drawn its bargain. In exchange for freedom, Ethan would now be forced to reveal his mind to two men. One, a stern professor who saw him as a treasure to be harnessed, the other, a therapist who might see him as something else entirely. What neither Ethan nor Harvard yet knew was that this bargain would shape the rest of his life. The janitor had left traces on the blackboard. Soon, those traces would lead others straight to the core of his wounded soul. The weeks after Ethan Miller's release unfolded with a strange rhythm. Mornings were spent pushing a mop across the polished floors of Harvard. Afternoons bent over blackboards under the strict gaze of Professor Whitman, and evenings seated in a quiet office across from a therapist named Dr. Samuel Hayes. At first, Ethan resisted both men. Whitman's intensity felt like a trap, as though every line of chalk were a leash tightening around his mind. Hayes, with his calm voice and patient eyes, seemed more dangerous still, asking questions that brushed against wounds Ethan had kept hidden for years. Yet slowly, almost against his will, Ethan began to speak. About the mines, about his grandmother's hands, about the silence that wrapped him in the nights of Appalachia. Hayes never pressed too hard. He simply listened, and in that listening, Ethan felt something he had not known in a long time: safety. But while one man offered shelter, another was fanning the flames of ambition. In the seminar halls, Ethan's name had not yet been spoken, but his presence was felt. His solutions, quietly left behind, had ignited whispers. Some called him a prodigy, others a phantom. Whitman, though outwardly composed, carried the secret like a jewel burning in his pocket. One evening, after a long session with Ethan, he brought the young man's notes to a gathering of colleagues. Around the table sat men and women of Harvard's mathematics faculty, their suits neat, their eyes sharp with the hunger of competition. Among them was Professor Adler, younger than Whitman, ambitious, with a smile that rarely reached his eyes. Whitman laid the papers down. "Gentlemen, ladies, I want you to see something. These are not my notes. They were written by an unusual source." The professors leaned in. They saw the clean logic, the innovative leap in the handling of fluid equations. Whispers rose. Someone muttered, "This is extraordinary." Adler lifted his brow. "Extraordinary indeed. But who is this mysterious author, Charles? One of your students, perhaps?" Whitman hesitated. His instinct was to protect Ethan's anonymity, yet pride tugged at him. At last he said, "Not a student. A man working outside the university. A janitor." Silence. Then laughter, sharp and dismissive. "A janitor," one colleague scoffed. "Charles, you've gone sentimental. Perhaps he copied it from somewhere." But Adler did not laugh. His eyes narrowed, calculating. "If what you say is true, then this janitor is a resource, or a risk. Imagine if such a discovery left Harvard's walls and landed in Princeton or Oxford or, God forbid, MIT. Do you really want our department to be outshone by a ghost sweeping our floors?" Whitman bristled. "He is not a ghost." He is a mathematician of rare insight. Adler's voice was silk over steel. Then bring him into the light, or someone else will. Back in the janitor's closet, Ethan was unaware of the gathering storm. He bent over scrap paper, his pencil dull, sketching functions that bent like rivers through unseen landscapes. For him, the work was not about prestige, it was about survival. Proofs gave order to a life scarred by chaos. But the walls of Harvard were never still. Word spread that Whitman was hiding something, perhaps even someone. A few graduate students whispered of strange chalk marks appearing overnight. Others began to linger after hours, hoping to catch a glimpse of the phantom. One evening, Ethan arrived early for his session. As he turned a corner, he overheard voices. "Whitman thinks he's discovered a genius," a student muttered. "But if this janitor is real, why should Whitman get the glory? If I found him, I'd have my name on the papers too." Their laughter followed Ethan down the hall. He tightened his grip on the mop until his knuckles whitened. He had not sought glory. He had not asked for this light. And yet, like a moth to flame, it seemed determined to find him. During a late-night session, Whitman pressed him harder than usual. "Ethan, these equations you've written, do you realize what they mean? With a few more steps, we could publish together. We could present at conferences. You could have a name." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I don't want a name." Whitman's eyes flashed with frustration. "You don't understand. The academic world is a battlefield. Ideas must be claimed or they are stolen. If you hide in the shadows, others will step forward and take what is yours." Ethan's voice was steady but low. "Let them. I'm not fighting your battles." For a moment, the two men stared at each other, one burning with ambition, the other rooted in refusal. Meanwhile, Adler began weaving his own net. Quietly, he reached out to colleagues beyond Harvard, hinting at a mysterious figure whose work might soon shake the world. He proposed collaborations, future conferences, grants, all on the assumption that he, Adler, would bring this phantom into the light. To him, Ethan was not a man. He was an opportunity. Dr. Hayes sensed the shift before Ethan spoke of it. During one session, the young man sat rigid, his eyes darker than usual. "They want something from me," Ethan murmured. "Who wants something?" "The professors. They circle like crows. They say if I don't claim my work, someone else will, but I don't care. I just want peace." Hayes leaned forward. "And yet you came here tonight instead of running. Why?" Ethan's eyes flickered. "Because part of me wonders if my grandmother was right. Maybe I was born to go farther. But every time I think about it, I see their faces. The ones who laugh, the ones who take." Hayes spoke softly. "Ethan, wounds are real, but talent is real too. The question is not whether you have a gift. The question is, what do you want that gift to serve?" The room fell silent. Outside, the winter wind rattled the windows. Inside, Ethan lowered his gaze, caught between fear of betrayal and the faint, fragile hope that his gift could mean something more than survival. In the weeks ahead, the cracks in Harvard grew wider. Whitman sought to shield Ethan. Adler schemed to exploit him, students whispered, and administrators grew curious. The university was no longer a sanctuary of silence. It was becoming an arena. And in its center stood a young man with calloused hands, carrying equations like secret wounds, unaware that the fiercest battles of his life were about to begin. Winter softened its grip on Cambridge by inches, not strides. The Charles River thawed at the edges first, a thin lace of water tracing dark lines along the ice. In the yard, students hurried between classes with collars turned up and hands deep in pockets, while robins tested the air as if asking permission to sing again. Ethan Miller pushed his mop through the hallway outside the biomedical labs, where the air smelled faintly of ethanol and old coffee. Here, the world felt different than in the math building. White coats moved with purpose. Machines hummed quietly. On the walls hung posters with careful graphs and acronyms that sounded like passwords. CRISPR, MRI, EEG. It was a language of bodies and signals, of healing mapped into careful lines. He was filling a bucket at the utility sink when the door swung wide and a young woman stepped into the corridor. She was carrying an armful of binders and a tray with 2 paper cups. A pen tucked behind her ear slipped and fell. The tray tilted, coffee listing toward disaster. Ethan set the bucket down and caught the tray with a quick, solid hand. The coffee steadied. The woman stared, startled, then laughed softly. "Thank you," she said. "I owe you one." She had clear eyes, the color of a sky that had just finished raining. Her hair was pulled back, practical and neat, but a strand had escaped, curling against her cheek. She wore a student badge, Emily Carter, Biomedical Sciences. Ethan nodded. No problem. He handed her the tray, then bent to pick up the fallen pen. Emily hesitated as if deciding whether to continue the conversation. "You work nights, right? I have seen you down here before." He shrugged. "I keep the floors from forgetting we care about them." She smiled at that. "I am Emily. Ethan." He paused, then added, "I mostly work in Widener and Seaver, but sometimes here." She shifted the binders in her arms. "Would you like one of these?" she asked, lifting a cup. "It is just campus coffee, not the good stuff. But it is warm." He hesitated. He was not used to being offered anything. Then he took the cup and wrapped his hands around it, grateful for the heat. "Thank you." She pushed the lab door open with her hip. "We are running an experiment. If you want to see something strange and wonderful, come by later. I will leave the door propped." Ethan stood in the hall with the mop in one hand and the coffee in the other. Strange and wonderful. The words rang in him like a bell. That evening he returned. Inside, the lab glowed with the quiet light of machines. Emily stood at a bench with a graduate student, passing a sensor over a small, clear chamber where heart cells pulsed in a slow rhythm. "They are cardiomyocytes," she explained when she saw Ethan. "Heart cells grown from stem cells. The pulse you see is calcium moving in and out. When calcium flows, the cell contracts. That is the beat." Ethan leaned closer. The tiny motion was steady, almost like a clock. "So the signal is the life," he said. "In a way, yes. If the calcium misfires, the beat stumbles. Sometimes we use models to predict when that happens." She gestured to a laptop where a simple graph trembled. "Here is a time series of the signal. Peaks are beats. If the peaks wander, we worry." Ethan studied the screen. Noise nibbled at the edges, small spikes not aligned with the main rhythm. "You could smooth the noise with a filter," he said quietly. "A moving average would clean it, but a Savitsky-Golay filter keeps the shape of the peak better. Or you could look at the spectrum with a Fourier transform to see if the wandering has a frequency. If it does, you can subtract it out." Emily blinked. "You know this stuff?" He tucked his hands into his jacket pockets. "I read. Sometimes in the library, sometimes on scrap paper." She watched him for a long moment, as if recalibrating a scale. Then she smiled. "I am impressed." He felt a warmth he could not name. He was used to being invisible. To be seen without judgment felt like sunlight after a long winter. They spent the next hour moving between cells and screens. Emily explained with a simple patience that made complex ideas feel human. She spoke of MRI images that turned the body into maps, and of EEG signals that recorded the brain's electricity in quiet waves. She explained that CRISPR was a tool that cut DNA with a kind of precision like editing a sentence without disturbing the paragraph. When the terms grew dense, she paused and translated, making the science into stories. For each explanation, Ethan offered something back. A way to fit a curve without distorting the edges. A cleaner method for subtracting baselines. He spoke softly, conscious that he stood on borrowed ground. Before he left, Emily said, "Come back any time. I could use a brain that sees patterns in noise." He nodded, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. In the hallway, he stood still a long time. Somewhere inside his chest, a door he had sealed shut moved on its hinges. Days turned into a pattern. Nights in the math building with Whitman, therapy with Dr. Hayes, then an hour in the biomedical lab where the machines hummed and Emily's voice smoothed the sharp edges of his day. She asked about his life in careful steps, not prying, but opening a path. He deflected, joked lightly, or changed the subject. She never pushed. Instead, she told him about her own family. A mother who taught high school English, a father who ran a small hardware store 2 towns over. Her childhood smelled of sawdust and paper. It had been, by her account, ordinary. She said the word with gratitude, not boredom. One evening they took coffee to a bench outside. The yard lay quiet under a lavender dusk. Bare branches traced fine lines across the sky. "You are not like the others," she said at last. "You are careful when you speak. The students rush. You choose your steps." "I work on floors," he said. "I know what happens when you do not watch where you step." She laughed gently. Then her tone changed. "You are hiding, Ethan." He stared at the ground. The impulse to deny rose in him, then faded. He could lie to many people. He could not lie to this voice. "Maybe," he said. "From what?" The question hung between them. He could say it was from the professors with their sharp eyes, or from the past with its sharper ones. He could say it was from the hunger of men who saw him as a prize, or from the pity of men who saw him as a cause. But the truth was simpler and harder. "From being known," he said. She nodded, as if she had expected this. "Being known is how we do not have to be alone." He swallowed. The words cut close. In therapy, Hayes had asked similar questions, but Emily's presence made them feel less like surgery and more like someone taking his hand in a dark room. Later in the lab, she handed him a small stack of articles. "Start with the abstracts. Skip the jargon in the middle if you need to. Tell me tomorrow what you think." She hesitated, then added, "And if you want to walk by the river this weekend, I would like that." He felt something lift and something tighten at once. The invitation was a bright thing in a quiet hallway, and it scared him. "We will see," he said. That night, he lay awake and read. The papers were not all friendly. Some were a thicket of terms that seemed designed to keep strangers out. But the graphs were honest. And he could read them the way he read clouds. He made notes in the margins in a careful hand. When dawn came, he tucked the papers under the algebra book, as if afraid that one would cancel the other. He met Hayes later that day. The therapist listened as Ethan spoke about the lab and the moving heart cells, about Emily's patience and the way she smiled with her eyes. "She sees you," Hayes said softly. Ethan stared at the carpet. "It feels like standing on a dock when the ice breaks. The water is there, and it is real, and you want to step up, but you also think about how cold you will be if you fall." Hayes nodded. "Fear is honest, but so is hope. The trick is not to let fear call itself wisdom. It is only fear." Ethan left the office with the city sharper around him, as if the light had been turned up a notch. He crossed the yard and found Emily at the bench with 2 coffees and a notebook. "You came," she said. "I did," he answered. They walked by the river where broken ice drifted in slow sheets. A rower cut through a dark lane of water, oars quiet as breath. "What do you want, Ethan?" she asked. The old answer was ready. To work with my hands, to keep my head down, to be left alone. But another answer, newer and smaller, knocked softly from inside. "I want a life that does not hide from itself," he said, surprised by his own voice. Her smile this time was warm enough to melt ice. "Then let us begin small. Dinner." No lab talk, just food. At the restaurant, he let her order. He watched the glow on her cheek and the way she set her fork down to listen. He told her a story about a library in a mountain town where the heater clanked and the books smelled like the inside of a cedar chest. He did not tell her about the night his father tore a notebook in half. He did not tell her about the room where his grandmother died. The door inside him had moved, but not yet opened. On the walk back, laughter lifted between them like steam in cold air. At the steps of her dorm, she paused. "I like you, Ethan." He felt the old reflex rise, to undercut, to escape, to find a back door. Instead, he took a breath. "I like you too, Emily." He did not kiss her. It was too soon, and the fear had not yet learned the difference between danger and tenderness. But his hand found hers for a moment, and that was enough. The academic world pressed in as always. Whitman's demands grew sharper. Adler's whispers wider. Rumors gathered around the lab and the math building like small storms, but for a few hours each day, in the quiet place where a heart cell beat on a glass slide and a woman with rain-colored eyes made science into a story, Ethan discovered something that had nothing to do with proof or prestige. He discovered that a mind can be brilliant and still need gentleness. He learned that intelligence is not a wall but a window, and that another person's gaze can make the view larger. He walked home under a sky that finally, shyly showed its stars. The city hummed. The river mumbled. In his pocket, the faded handkerchief rasped against his fingers, and he pressed it once, lightly, as if to say, "We are still here." In his room, he set the algebra book down and the lab papers beside it. He took the mirror from the wall and wiped it clean. For a long time, he did not write anything. He just watched his own face and tried to imagine it as someone worth being known. And far down the hall of his memory, a door opened the width of a hand. Light came through, and it did not hurt his eyes. Not yet. Not anymore. Spring at Harvard came late that year. Snow lingered in the shaded corners of the yard, melting into small rivulets that wound between cobblestones. Students hurried toward exams, their voices anxious, their faces pale with the strain of too much knowledge pressed into too little time. Ethan Miller kept to his rhythm, mop, bucket, chalk. He worked the nights, studied under Professor Whitman in the afternoons, and walked the river with Emily whenever courage allowed. Dr. Hayes continued to ask his gentle, piercing questions, and Ethan continued to answer just enough to keep the silence from closing in. But beyond his small circle, the walls of Harvard were shifting. Admiration had curdled into envy. What had begun as whispers of awe now hardened into suspicion. Professors debated behind closed doors. Administrators asked careful questions. If a janitor can solve our problems, where does that leave us? The storm broke on a Thursday evening. Professor Adler stood before a crowded seminar, chalk in hand, voice smooth as silk. On the board behind him was a sequence of equations, steps in the Navier-Stokes problem, drawn with clarity and power. "Tonight," Adler declared, "I present a new result, a lemma on boundedness that clears a path we have long sought." Murmurs of approval filled the room. Graduate students scribbled notes. Faculty leaned forward. It was elegant work, the kind that suggested long nights of quiet brilliance. But Ethan, standing in the doorway with his mop, froze. The lines on the board were his. Every curve, every bound, every word. They were his. He had written them on the chalkboard weeks ago, in silence, without a name. And now they shone under Adler's name, gilded with applause. The room clapped. Adler bowed his head with false humility. Whitman, seated at the side, gripped his cane so tightly his knuckles blanched. His eyes darted to Ethan in the doorway, then back to the stage. He knew. Afterward, Whitman cornered Adler in the corridor. "You took his work," he hissed. Adler's smile was thin. "Work left unattended is work unclaimed. You cannot protect him forever, Charles. If he is truly what you say, let him step into the light. Otherwise, the world belongs to those who dare." Whitman's hands shook with anger. "He is not your pawn." Adler leaned closer. "Then you are a fool. Do you think the university will celebrate a janitor who hides in closets? No. They will celebrate whoever writes the paper first. That can be me, or you, but not him." He walked away, his shoes echoing against the stone, leaving Whitman trembling with fury. Ethan returned to his room that night with the stolen proof burning in his mind. He tried to write, but the mirror stayed blank. His grandmother's algebra book lay open, silent. The faded handkerchief slipped from his pocket, and for once, he did not pick it up. When Emily knocked at his door later, he barely looked up. "What happened?" she asked softly. "They took it," he said. His voice was flat, not broken, not angry, just empty. "I wrote something on a board, and now another man stands before a crowd and calls it his, and they clap." Emily stepped inside, closing the door. "Then tell them it was you. Show them." Ethan shook his head. "That is not my world. They would not believe me. And even if they did, what then? Another man with sharper elbows would take the next thing, and the next." She touched his shoulder. "You are not invisible, Ethan. Not anymore." He looked at her, eyes shadowed. "Maybe I should have stayed invisible." The next therapy session with Hayes was different. Ethan sat rigid, arms crossed. "They stole from me," he said. Hayes nodded slowly. "Tell me what that feels like." Ethan's voice cracked. "Like being a boy again. Like watching my father tear my notebook in half. Like everything I write will end up in someone else's hands and I will be left with nothing." Hayes leaned forward. "And yet here you are, still speaking. That means you have not given up." Ethan shook his head. "What is the point?" "The point," Hayes said softly, "is that the worth of your mind is not measured by applause. It is measured by what it gives. To you and to those you choose. A thief can steal words, but not the source." Ethan looked away. "That is not how Harvard sees it." "No," Hayes admitted. "But perhaps you are not meant to give Harvard what it wants. Perhaps you are meant to give something else." Days passed. Whitman tried to shield him, but Adler's maneuver had already gained traction. Administrators spoke of grants, of recognition, of Harvard's prestige. They did not ask who had written the lines, only who had claimed them. Adler's name spread. Ethan's did not. One evening, Whitman found Ethan sitting alone in the library, staring at an open page without reading. "I should have protected you," Whitman said. Ethan looked up. "You could not." The professor lowered himself into a chair. His voice trembled. "You are right. I failed. But you must not walk away. You must keep writing. Do not let Adler's theft end you." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You all see equations as weapons, trophies. I see them as something else. And maybe I am done sharing them." Whitman's eyes widened. "Ethan, listen to me. Your mind is a gift. If you bury it, the world loses something irreplaceable. Ethan's voice rose. And if I share it, the world steals it. Tell me, Professor, which is worse? The silence between them was heavy. Finally, Ethan gathered his papers and walked away, leaving Whitman staring into the dim light, haunted by a truth he could not answer. That night, Ethan returned to the mirror. For the first time, he did not write equations. He wrote words. They will take everything. Then he erased them slowly, until nothing remained. But Hayes's words lingered. A thief can steal words, but not the source. He touched the handkerchief again, pressing it against his palm. His grandmother's voice whispered in the stillness, "Do not let this place swallow you." For the first time, Ethan wondered if survival meant more than silence. If perhaps, just perhaps, he could choose a different path. Not for Harvard, not for Whitman, not against Adler, but for himself. The storm had come. And in its heart, Ethan's fire flickered, not extinguished, but waiting. Snow returned to Cambridge without ceremony. It began as a hush, a soft thickening of the air, and then the first flakes drifted down, quiet as breath. By dusk, Harvard Yard had turned pale, every brick softened, every step slower. The lamps made small golden islands in the whiteness. Ethan Miller walked beneath those lamps with a folder under his arm. The folder was thin, but it felt heavy. Inside were pages written in his careful hand. Not equations alone, though there were enough of those to mark a path. There were dates, times, room numbers. A record of nights when chalk dust clung to his cuffs and silence kept him company. There were notes from custodial logs that placed him in rooms at hours when no class met. There were fragments of proofs in the margin of discarded printouts, the same lines that later appeared on the seminar board with another man's name above them. It was not a weapon. It was a witness. He slipped the folder into Professor Whitman's mailbox and stood a moment in the dim hallway. He could have made copies for the dean, for the department chair, for the journals. He could have thrown the pages like stones. Instead, he left one set, addressed to the one man who had seen him first. When Ethan stepped back outside, snow caught on his lashes. The yard was almost empty. Footprints crossed and recrossed in slow trails that the weather would soon erase. He turned toward Widener. The doors were locked now, the way they get on snow nights when workers go home early. He stood under the portico and listened to the fine sound of snow striking stone. His grandmother would have liked this kind of night. She would have made tea, set the mug near the window, and said nothing at all. They would have watched the hills grow white and let the silence do the holding. He put his hands in his coat pockets and felt the folded handkerchief. The fabric had thinned over the years. It held anyway. The next morning he met Dr. Hayes. The therapist's office felt warmer than usual, as if the radiator had decided for once to do its job. Hayes poured tea and waited, the way he always did. "I wrote it all down," Ethan said. "What I did, where, when. I left it for Whitman." "Do you want him to fight for you, or for the truth?" Hayes asked. "They are not always the same," Ethan said. "No," Hayes said, "but sometimes they meet in the middle." "What do you want, Ethan?" "I want to stop thinking about revenge. It eats hours. It makes the mirror ugly. I want to go back to work. I want to walk with Emily and feel the air without tasting metal." Hayes nodded. Forgiveness is not pretending it did not happen. It is choosing a future that is not chained to it. "What if the future ignores me anyway?" Ethan asked. "Then you keep choosing," Hayes said. "That is the quiet work. It is not less brave for being quiet." Ethan looked at the window. Snow had stopped. The world outside was a page waiting for marks. Later that day, Whitman found him in a stairwell wiping salt from the steps. The professor's scarf was dusted white, his hair a little wild. "I read it," he said without greeting. Ethan kept working. "Good." There was a tremor in the older man's voice that Ethan had not heard before. "This is not only proof that you were first. It is a map of how you think. It is beautiful." Ethan set the rag in the bucket and stood. "I did not write it for beautiful. I wrote it so I could stop writing it in my head." Whitman's eyes were bright. "There is a faculty meeting tonight. The committee will discuss recent presentations. I am going to speak." "About what?" Ethan asked. "About a theft," Whitman said. "About a man who cleans our floors and writes like a bell rings. About my failure to stand between him and the hands that take. About naming what is true." "You do not have to," Ethan said. "I do," Whitman said. "Not for you alone. For me." The meeting was set for evening. Outside, the sky cleared to a hard blue that comes only after snow. Students slid carefully along the paths, laughing at their own missteps. On a bench by the river, Emily watched the light lose its color. She had texted Ethan between classes. "Walk," she had asked. He joined her as the sun lowered. "How is your day?" she asked. "It might turn," he said. He told her about the folder, about the meeting. He did not tell her what he feared. He did not need to. She knew. "Do you want me there?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not this part. But thank you." She squeezed his hand. Then she did not let go. They sat that way until the cold drove them up. At the door of her building, she touched his cheek with a glove. "For luck," she said. "Come back after." The faculty room was high-ceilinged and wood-paneled. Portraits watched from the walls. They had watched many storms. They were quiet now. The department chair called the meeting to order. Reports, funding, exams. The old machinery of a university clanked and hummed. Then the chair turned to recent talks. "Professor Adler, your lemma has gathered attention. We have heard interest from 2 journals. Congratulations." Adler inclined his head. "Thank you." "Before the next item," Whitman said, rising. His voice was steady. "I would like to speak to authorship." A few heads turned. A few did not. The chair nodded. "We are charged with the care of knowledge," Whitman said. "Not only with guarding it, but with naming its sources honestly. A month ago, an intermediate result in the Navier-Stokes program appeared on a classroom board without a name. It was not a joke. It was not a theft from the literature. It was original and correct. The same lines, with slight changes, later appeared in a seminar under a different name. That is the fact." Words thickened in the room. Some faces cooled, others sharpened. "Who wrote it first?" someone asked. A pause. "A man who works here at night," Whitman said. "He mops our floors and knows our library better than our students. He is not enrolled. He is not hired to think. He thinks anyway." There were murmurs now, some skeptical, some curious. The chair raised a hand. "Professor Adler," the chair said, "do you have a response?" Adler's smile was patient. "In mathematics, ideas evolve. Similar lines occur because the truth is narrow. If someone wishes to claim priority, they should publish. Ghosts do not hold citations." Whitman turned. He held up a single page. "The first draft," he said, "with dates and room notes and marginal proofs that match the later board. It is not a ghost. It is a man." He placed the page on the table. He did not name Ethan. He let the paper do the speaking. The room divided. A senior professor with a soft voice said that justice matters. A younger one said that precedent matters more. Someone asked whether the janitor had permission to be in those rooms. Someone else said the rooms were not owned by one kind of mind. Through it all, Whitman stood without raising his voice. He did not accuse Adler by name. He did not list grievances. He said a simpler thing. "We are watched by the young," he said. "If our lesson to them is that power names truth, then we deserve to be forgotten. If our lesson is that truth names itself and we follow, then we might still be worthy." Silence settled. The chair cleared his throat. "We will convene a small committee to review priority," the chair said at last. "Until then, any submissions on the lemma are paused." Adler's mouth thinned. He gathered his papers with care that did not hide his anger. When it was over, Whitman walked out into the snow and stood under the old elms. He felt both light and very tired. He looked up and found Ethan waiting in the shadows. "You heard," Whitman said. "Enough," Ethan said. "Do you hate me for not stopping this sooner?" Whitman asked. Ethan looked toward the yard. Students moved in twos and threes, scarves bright against the white. He thought of bar fights and handcuffs and nights when rage had been the only heat he knew. He thought of the folder in the mailbox and the old man in the meeting speaking as if each word were a plank laid across a river. "No," Ethan said. "I am done hating. It is heavy." Whitman's breath left him like relief. He nodded once. They stood together a moment, two figures in an old winter. Ethan turned toward Emily's building. He climbed the steps and knocked. She opened the door with her coat already on. "How did it go?" she asked. "They will look into it," he said. No applause, no torches, just a small door cracked open. She smiled. "That sounds like a beginning." They walked to a small diner where the windows fogged in circles, and the pie was better than it had any right to be. They talked about nothing in particular. When the check came, he reached for it and she let him, which felt like the kind of dignity that does not need to be named. Later he went home and took the mirror from the wall. He cleaned it with a long, even stroke. He set the marker down and did not touch it. For once the blankness did not accuse him. It invited him. He took out a sheet of paper and wrote a letter, not to the chair or the journal, to a library in a mountain town. "Dear Sir or Madam," he wrote, "if you have a spare copy of an introductory text on partial differential equations, I can pay a small amount in postage." Then he added a line for the children near the mines, for a class he did not yet have. "If you have two, send both." He sealed the envelope and placed it by the door. Before bed, he called Hayes and left a message. "Thank you," he said, "for reminding me that quiet work is still work." He texted Emily. "Thank you for the walk." He folded the handkerchief and slipped it under his pillow like a small flag. Outside, the yard lay clean and white, the day's prints filling in under the slow drift. In the morning there would be paths again, fresh ones. Tonight the world allowed itself to rest. Forgiveness does not change the past. It loosens its hand. On that snow night, in a room no one would ever visit, a young man closed his eyes and let go of what he could not carry. He did not know yet what would come, but he knew there was a way forward that did not require revenge. And in that knowing, the quiet fire that had once flickered became a steady glow, enough to warm a small room, enough to begin. The train wound its way through the Appalachian hills, each bend revealing valleys where cabins clung like stubborn memories. It had been years since Ethan Miller had seen these mountains. The ridges rose dark against the sky, their slopes scarred by mines long abandoned. Yet in the hollows, small towns still breathed, quiet and worn, their people bound together by the hard soil and the harder winters. Ethan stepped down onto the platform with a single bag slung over his shoulder. Inside were not clothes alone, but the algebra book his grandmother had once placed in his hands, its pages frayed, its spine nearly broken. At the bottom of the bag lay the folded handkerchief, the only piece of his mother he had ever touched. He had carried both across years of silence, across Harvard's halls, across betrayal and discovery. Now he brought them home. He rented a small room above the old post office. The town was poorer than he remembered, though perhaps he was only now old enough to see it clearly. Children wandered after school with no place to go, their faces sharp with hunger not only for food but for direction. The old library, its heater long dead, had become a storage shed. One evening, Ethan asked the librarian, an elderly woman with white hair pinned in a bun, if he might borrow the unused back room. "What for?" she asked. "A class," Ethan said simply. The woman studied his face, as if weighing whether he was a dreamer or a fool. Then she handed him the keys. On a Monday afternoon, Ethan set up 3 borrowed desks and a blackboard so cracked it leaned against the wall for balance. He wrote a single triangle on it. Underneath, 3 letters, A, B, C. When the first children arrived, they shuffled in shyly. A boy of 12, his shoes too thin for the cold. A girl with freckles, carrying a notebook with no cover. A pair of brothers who whispered to each other in low voices, uncertain if they were allowed to stay. Ethan smiled gently. "Come in," he said. "This class is for anyone who wants to see how numbers make sense of the world." He pointed to the triangle. "This is Pythagoras. It says if you know 2 sides of a right triangle, you can always find the third. Simple, but it works every time. That's the power of math. It tells the truth. No matter where you are." The children leaned forward, eyes wide. He let them draw their own triangles, guided their hands as they squared the sides, and watched the numbers fall into place. Laughter bubbled up when the sums matched. For a moment, the hunger in their eyes turned to light. News spread quickly. By the next week, twice as many children came. Some parents stood in the doorway, skeptical at first, then quiet as they watched their sons and daughters bent over chalk. A coal miner's widow left a basket of cornbread on the desk. A shopkeeper donated a stack of pencils. The back room of the library began to glow each evening, warm not from heaters, but from the murmur of discovery. Emily arrived on a Saturday, her coat dusted with travel. She stepped into the room as Ethan was showing the class how to plot points on a graph. When he looked up and saw her, his face softened in a way the children noticed. They grinned at each other, whispering. After class, Emily walked with him along the main street, past shuttered shops and weathered porches. "This place needs you," she said quietly. "I need it too," Ethan replied. "Harvard was never home. Here, maybe I can give what my grandmother gave me. A door, even if it only opens a little." She slipped her hand into his. "Then let's build it together." Letters began to arrive, forwarded by the librarian who still kept the mail. The first came from Professor Whitman. "Ethan, the committee ruled in your favor. Adler's claim is suspended. They may never give you the credit you deserve in public, but know that in the halls of mathematics, your work is known. Forgive me for what I failed to do, and know that I am proud of what you are doing now." Another letter came from Dr. Hayes. "The hardest work is not on the board, Ethan, but in the heart. You have chosen not revenge, but legacy. That is the greater proof." Ethan folded each letter carefully and placed them in the algebra book where once he had hidden his grandmother's notes. As seasons turned, the class grew. The cracked blackboard was replaced with a sturdier one, gifted by a church group. Children brought friends, who brought cousins, until the back room could no longer hold them all. They moved to the community center, where light streamed through tall windows and desks lined the floor. Ethan taught more than formulas. He spoke of patience, of order, of how even chaos in the world could sometimes be mapped into shapes and rhythms. He told them about Harvard, not to boast, but to remind them that greatness does not belong only to those born into wealth. It belongs to anyone willing to listen carefully to the truth numbers whisper. At the end of each lesson, he would fold the handkerchief once, place it on the desk, and remind the children, every proof begins with something small, a line, a triangle, a step. Every life begins the same way. Small steps. Keep walking. Years later, a visitor from Boston arrived. It was Whitman, his hair now white, his steps slower. He sat quietly in the back of the classroom as Ethan guided a group of teenagers through the basics of calculus. When the lesson ended, Whitman rose, leaning on his cane. "You have built something here," he said softly. "Not me," Ethan replied. "Them." Whitman smiled faintly. "Perhaps both. You have taken theorems and turned them into firewood for a cold town. That is no lesser genius." They sat together on the porch of the library as dusk settled. The hills were quiet. The sky turned violet. "Do you miss Harvard?" Whitman asked. Ethan looked at the children spilling out of the community center, their voices alive. He shook his head. "No. Harvard was a chapter. This is the book." On the night of the town's first snowfall that winter, Ethan walked home with Emily. The children had gone, their laughter trailing into the dark. Snow fell thick, coating the roofs, the roads, the old mine entrances carved into the hills. He stopped and looked back at the glowing windows of the center. "Do you see it?" he asked Emily. "What?" "The fire. Small, but enough to warm the whole valley." She squeezed his arm. "I see it." They walked on, their footprints pressing into the white. Behind them, the center's lights burned steady, like a lighthouse in the hills. Ethan touched the handkerchief in his pocket and whispered a word only the snow heard. Grandma. He no longer needed Harvard's applause, nor Adler's envy, nor even the world's recognition. He had built something quieter, steadier. A legacy of children with notebooks open, pencils scratching, eyes bright with discovery. A flame, not for the sky, but for the hearth. And sometimes that is the greater miracle. Thank you for taking the time to walk with me through this story. If it gave you even a little warmth, a little healing, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Each subscription is like adding a small log to the fire, so we can keep gathering here, sharing more stories of knowledge, kindness, and the quiet light found in lives that once seemed lost. I look forward to seeing you in the next story.